This is part 8 of the Craftsman Emerson Gen 2 Rebuild series. If you haven't seen part 7, click the link at the top of the screen. In this video, we will be finishing our reassembly. Hello everyone, I'm Jeff and welcome to my shop. We got a lot to cover, so let's get to it. Continuing with the assembly from part 7, I'm just installing what they call in the parts diagram the capacitor clip, but it's clearly a wire clip that is used to hold the power wire to the head, just like you see there. And I had polished this piece. This was one of those things that didn't come with the drill press, but frankly hooked me up. The next thing we need to do is install the retaining ring on the quill. So I'm just placing the quill in the vise, and then I use vise grips on the retaining ring. And this is how I take it off as well. I'll just spread the vise grips apart, widening the opening in the retaining ring, and slide it over the quill like so. Too easy. So now we're going to assemble the quill spindle assembly. There's a washer. That's a change on this quill from the previous Gen 1s. And then there is the gasket, which is the same as all of the other previous drill presses, the 100s, 150s, and the Gen 1s. I've got some bearings that I got from Accurate Bearing. And these are actually notchy bearings. They just didn't come in a notchy box. And these bearings are special bore bearings, so they've got a 5/8 bore. So we'll just slide that on the spindle, and gets a little hung up there. I'll just use a piece of pipe to slide it down further. And just smack it with the hammer and it'll go. Like so. And then the bearings are retained by these snap rings, so thank God I've got my new set of snap ring pliers to be able to do this effortlessly. So I was just checking to see which direction I have that snap ring. One side of the snap ring is kind of flat, and the other side's got rounded edges. And you want the flat edge facing away from the bearing so that it won't work its way loose. Then we can slide the quill down over the bearing. And then we add the top bearing. And there's another snap ring that holds that bearing in place. That's also a change from the previous drill press models. And next we need to prepare the chuck for installation. So here I'm just spinning in a large Allen wrench into the chuck jaws. Just make sure you line up the jaws with the flats on the Allen wrench. Tighten it down. We'll put that in a vise. Now we need to clean the socket in the chuck and the Jacob's taper on the spindle with acetone, just to make sure it's completely free of oil and debris and everything. So this is the only metal on metal parts that I have on drill presses that don't get some sort of lubrication. So we've got the feed stop bracket, and there's a washer that goes in that, which acts as a spacer. Then we slide that on the quill. It's not going to stay in place because I don't have a screw in it right now, but we have to put it on before we put the chuck on, otherwise we can't get it on. So we'll go ahead and spin the safety lock collar on the chuck onto the thrust collar that's on the spindle. Then we'll use that gear wrench, spanner wrench, to tighten it down. And there we go. Then we can just loosen the Jacob's chuck and pull it off of the Allen wrench. So now we're ready to install the spring. So there's a roll pin inside the head casting, and we're just going to hook that double loop spring on there, and then we'll slide the hub pinion assembly in. And notice that I did add that fiber washer to the pinion. And then I'm going to use a spike to basically grab one loop of that spring through the pinholes, or the pin hole that's in the hub and the pinion. And I recently put out a video on this whole process of installing and removing the feed return springs, but it's not a difficult thing. Then we'll come in from the back side with a 1/4 inch punch, which is the same size as the actual pin that's going to get put in here. And we're just going to follow the spike with the punch through one side of the hub and the pinion, through the spring loop, and then out the other side of the hub and pinion, so that the spring is captured on that 1/4 inch punch. And then we will come back in from the opposite side with the actual pin, making sure that the splined end of that pin is facing away from the hub. And once we get it lined up, we'll just go in as far as we can, and then we'll finish it off with the punch and a hammer so that that pin is flush with the hub wall. Too easy. So then we're going to lube up the quill with some super lube. And then we'll insert the spindle quill assembly into the bore, and it's going to come up until it engages with the pinion. And so we have to pull out on the hub and the pinion to let the gears on the pinion interact with the gear rack on the quill. And we have to manipulate that spindle pulley assembly on top so that the splines on the spindle align with it. And once we've got everything squared away, I think I've got the quill canted just a little bit to the left, so I have to turn it a little bit to the right. And then it should run smoothly. There's about an 1/8 of an inch play there. But the pinion will keep the spindle in the drill press. So now we can go ahead and add the bolt, lock, washer, and nut for the feed stop bracket. And then we can add the feed stop rod and put the nut on the bottom of it. Now all that is really loose right now because I've got to line it up to make sure that everything's going to travel nicely and not grind on anything. It's got those 2 protrusions that come off of the head casting that the feed stop rod's got to ride in. So we'll line it up and make sure that everything's going to ride good. Make sure that we've got the feed stop bracket fully seated on the quill. And then we can tighten it down with a 7/16 wrench. And then we can tighten down the feed stop rod nut with a 9/16 wrench. Now sometimes an easier way to do that is to actually stick like a business card on each side of the feed stop rod in the 2 protrusions that come off of the head casting, and that'll keep it kind of centered. So here I'm just spinning on the feed handle rods, and then we'll add the knobs. And then we've got the feed stop collar. So we're just reassembling that. Oh, we're going to put some lube on it. Just on the threaded area for the fine adjustment. And then we can go ahead and place it on the feed stop rod. And lock it down. So now if we pull out the hub pinion, the feed stop collar will keep the quill from falling out of the drill press. So now what we're going to do is we're going to pull out on the hub and turn it counterclockwise, and this tensions the spring. You can see it's already pulling up the quill. So once we've got it to the point that it will retain the quill in its highest position or locked position, we just make sure that we've got enough tension on there that it's going to retract it completely. And then I'll spin it to line up one of the feed stop rods. I like having them at a 90-degree angle from the head casting. Not that, that. There we go. So we're just adding the small set screw for the Quill's lock. And then we're going to lube up the Quill lock nut and the Quill lock sleeve. This is the same process as the head lock or the table lock. So that's the lock nut. And then the sleeve goes in the other side with the screw. And then we'll tighten that down. And then we've got the chromed handle that goes on that screw that we will align with the screw with it in the lock position. And then we'll rotate it so that we can access where the set screw needs to go to hold the chrome handle on the lock screw. And we'll just install that set screw. So here I'm just lubing up the shaft on the motor hinge assembly. And then we'll insert that into the head casting. I really like this design for the motor hinge and motor mount. I don't know why they, well, I do know why they changed it for the Gen 3s, but I still like this design. Probably my favorite motor mounting design of all of the Craftsman, King Sealy, or Emerson drill presses. A lot of flexibility with it. So we're just adding the lock screw for it. And I'm not going to lock it down yet. So here we are adding the motor mount assembly to the motor. If you recall, I polished up those carriage bolt heads. So we're just adding the washer and square nuts on the bottom. And once we've got that locked down, then we can install it. And there's a rubber washer that goes between it and the hinge assembly, and then the hinge pin goes in both parts once I get it lined up. So here I'm just installing the belt adjustment clamp. And then the rod. And again, it's a very simple design. I like its simplistic approach. Nothing complicated. And this is very similar to how it is on the Gen 3s, 4s, and 5s as well, to tension the belt. I'm just going to lock it down so that the rod doesn't slide back out. So we'll install the keyway on the rotor shaft for the motor. Then we'll slide the motor pulley onto that shaft. And then we'll add the set screw that locks it in place. And I'm going to lock it in place here, but we're going to adjust it. So the way we adjust that is we just put a level across the top of both pulleys. And then you can drop it down until it's level and then lock it in place. And so the motor pulley is about 1/8 of an inch above the motor, which is where we want it. We'll go ahead and plug in the motor. So we've got a brand new belt. It's a 45-inch by 1/2 inch cogged V-belt. I like these. Frank Lee turned me on to them, and they're quieter and they run smoother. I get mine from AutoZone. It's a Duralast belt. So we're going to move that down to the bottom sheave on both pulleys, which should be the slowest speed. Then we'll go ahead and align and then lock the lock bolt for the hinge. And then we can tension the belt. So we just loosen that screw on the rod, or the screw that holds the rod in place on the clamp. And then push out on the motor or away from the head. That adds the tension to the belt. Make sure everything's lined up because we do have a cover that has to go over both of these pulleys. And then we lock it in place. So speaking of the cover, we need to go ahead and install the cap, which is the clear faceplate, and then the spindle cover. So the cap has 4 of these screws, and then the spindle cover has 3. And once we've got all that tightened down, we can go ahead and set the cover on the drill press. So we'll insert the pivot rod that I fabricated. Once I get it lined up. And then I need to back it into the center of the drill press to get those nylon washers on both sides. And then we'll add the metal washer to the outside and then the wing nuts. Apparently there were at least 2 different designs for this across these 3 years of these drill presses being made. But this is what I came up with. Make sure everything functions. And then we'll add a LED light bulb to the lamp. I like using the brightest white LED bulbs that I can get my hands on. Not a fan of incandescent bulbs, especially in machinery. Then we've got the trim panel that goes on the front that I got from Frank Lee. And that has 2 screws on it, one on the top and one on the bottom. I think Craftsman should have done some sort of logo or something on this trim panel rather than it being that quick stop guide. So we're going to make sure everything works by just powering it on. Making sure that everything is clearing properly and is not binding on anything. And here we go with the finished photo shoot of this Craftsman Emerson 1969 15.5 inch Generation 2 drill press. And I gotta say, of all of the drill presses that I've rebuilt or worked on, this is the one that I don't want to really sell. I don't really want to get rid of it. It just, when you've been doing this for this long, something this rare and unique is something you want to hang on to. I really, really like it, but I don't have the room for it. So after this photo shoot, I listed it, and within an hour of me listing it, a friend of mine off of Garage Journal that lives local to me told me that he wanted it. So he is getting this drill press. So at least it's going to somebody I know is going to appreciate it. But yeah, I really, really, really like this drill press, which is completely weird. This was my least favorite of all of the Craftsman classic drill presses when I first started getting into drill presses, just because of how it looked. I hated how it looked. But it's my favorite. I don't know how else to explain it. And if you've had more than one drill press in your life and you've worked on them, once you've worked on something like this, you'd understand. It's just such a unique and cool piece of machinery. Yeah, it doesn't look as Art Deco as the 100s and the 150s, but it's just packed with all of that technology that was learned during the 100s and the 150s and put into this machine. So that's the drill press, and that completes this series. More than likely, this is what's coming up next. This is a Craftsman 3-wheel 12-inch bandsaw on a pedestal. And you can see the condition it's in now. And it won't look like that when I'm done with it. And so it is model 103-24300. So this is a King Sealy. And it will go nicely with my other classic Craftsman 12-inch bandsaw, which is over here. And And that's going to wrap up this series. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it helpful. If you did, please like and subscribe. I appreciate all the comments and support, and I will see you next time.